Welcome to Outside Ourselves, a podcast featuring conversations that remind us faith isn't something we do, it's something we receive. I'm Kelsey Climbera. Today I'm chatting with my internet friend, and I can now say my real friend because I met her this past weekend, Jane Grizzle. Jane is a writer. She writes a lot for our friends over at Mockingbird. She's also heavily involved with some friends of ours in a ministry called Storymakers. You should check out both of those if you haven't already. Jane is one of my favorite writers to read. She is also really, really interested in this topic of the theology of the body, which is something I have found myself also interested in the past couple of years. So I'm really excited for you to hear our conversation today about just that, about bodies, about theology, about how the physical and the spiritual work together, how there is good news to the fact that God has given us bodies, how he has come in an incarnate form to save us, and also how sometimes we can get the physicality of this life mixed up and how we can misunderstand it. Jane brings a lot of grace, a lot of understanding to this conversation. I think you're really, really going to enjoy it. Here's the episode. Jane, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to see you. We just saw each other this weekend in person, but we're back together on the screen today. So good to see you.
Good to see you. We're back on the internet where we're better friends, I think, since we've only met one time in person. But
that is true. I know you through Mockingbird stuff, through Storymakers stuff. Mockingbird is, of course, an organization that 1517 does a lot with and that you write for. And then Storymakers is somewhat connected to Mockingbird, to 1517. And I know that you are involved there as well. Could you just give us a little bit about who you are and what you do, so people kind of have an intro to you?
Sure. I do write for Mockingbird, and I'm on the board of Storymakers. So those are kind of like my involvement in those organizations. I'm a mom of 3. My kids are 11, 8, and 6. And I'm currently a doctorate of ministry student at Western Theological Seminary in a cohort called The Secret Art of Writing. So it's a lot of people who are interested in faith and words and the importance of words and beauty and creativity to the gospel, and how the gospel informs all of those things in our lives too. So Wayne Collier is the program director up there, and he is a really great guide on those things. It's through the Eugene Peterson Center. So all of that is interconnected. I'm in graduate school and I have 3 kids, and that is pretty much what I do.
That's a lot. That program is interesting. Is there anything, how did you find it? And I've never really heard of anything like that. Is that, I know it's kind of like a newer program. What are you kind of hoping to do with that eventually?
Well, I've always written about where faith and kind of everyday problems intersect, especially around issues of health and mental health. And so for me, it was a program that was willing to look at reality and how God enters into that, and to help me use my language and words in ways that are building people up in those areas and are speaking truth in those areas. Wayne Collier, the director, was actually my parents' pastor in Virginia. And when he started the program, I found out about it through all of my parents' church friends. And I applied, and even the application process was really good for me to think about why I write and what it means to, they said something interesting about the ministry of words and books. And I thought that's the ministry I have, is a ministry of writing. I'm not a minister of any kind outside of that. And so it really, even their application gave me a vision for what I wanted to do with my work. So I applied and got in, and went the first time very nervous and fell in love with it, and have just been so encouraged to think about things differently.
How would you say has it changed, like, how you thought about words and theology?
Yeah, my advisors, there are three advisors, Wynn and this guy, John Blaze, who's a poet and a former pastor. And then a woman named Marilyn McIntyre, who wrote a book called Caring for Words and the Culture of Lies. And just thinking about the specificity of our language, thinking about using the right words when we talk about faith, that we don't just use kind of Christian lingo, but that it's accessible to everyone. And also the importance of the interplay between light and dark. Like, we live in a broken world, but we are people of hope. And so how do you talk about something like mental illness with hope and grace and mercy rather than just sort of defeat? So it's been really interesting to think about. I think it is rubbing off a lot of my more cynical edges about both the world and the church. And one of the coolest things is it's people from all different backgrounds. I think there are several people who are from different churches than I have ever attended. And so it's really made me consider how my language is so specific to my life and how to think about it in a way that's more open to people than just sort of the lingo that I use or the jargon that I use.
I think that's so important, and it's difficult to do, especially when you're kind of seeped in a tradition of very strong language. Like, I feel like we both are a little bit. So that's awesome. That sounds like a really cool experience. I'm excited to see what you do with it when you're finished. Well, like you mentioned, you write a lot about mental health, where theology kind of intersects with every day. And I know you've also written a lot about and spoken about theology of the body, which is something I'm also interested in. So that's what I'm excited to talk to you more about today. Can you kind of tell me a little bit about why that topic has been important for you and how you first got interested in it?
Yeah, I'll try to not make this super long, but
you can make it long if you want.
Okay, I'll work on that. I'm thinking of my advisors talking about brevity. So when I was 16, I was a swimmer. We're going way back. I was a swimmer, and I felt a pop one day, and I had torn my rotator cuff, which most of my friends didn't do. They were swimming and kept swimming, and their bodies just kept going. And that was sort of I was 16. It was a rough and rude awakening to the fact that my body does not work as it seems like it should. And that really was sad for me. I lost a sport and a community because of that, and it never really healed properly. And then the following year, I went into a major depression, probably related, to that. And it was just really lonely at a time that other kids are living these lives of sort of, believing they're just invincible. And I was very aware of my limitations and things like that. So I started thinking, and through that whole process, there were some Christians who had really good answers for me when I would say, why did this happen to me? Or, what on earth is God doing here? And there were some that had really bad answers. So I've always been drawn to the stories in the Bible that are people being healed, not necessarily because I am expecting healing for myself, but just I think it informs how Jesus looks at illness and weakness. And as I started to look at that, I was just really touched by the compassion and grace I think he has for people with broken bodies. So it became more important for me to understand that. And then this fall, I kept playing around with this talk idea for a Mockingbird conference about limitations of the body after Dave's book came out. And he talks about limitations and that word. I started thinking about it in terms of the body, like physical limitations. And so I was playing around with it. And as I was driving one day, I yawned and locked my jaw. So I couldn't open it very far. And it was very frustrating. All through the Christmas season, I could only eat soft foods or like flat foods for a while. It was like a lot of quesadillas and soup. I've eaten a lot of soup, lots. And Whole Foods has a great tomato basil soup that I've discovered and loved. But it was just kind of depressing and sad. And I kept thinking, why would God let us have limited bodies? And what is this teaching me? Which is Kate Bowler talks a lot about this. It's like a prosperity gospel that we have to have a lesson out of everything, and that everything has a silver lining, and it's building our faith. And I wanted to think about it in a way that's not so, not always positive. Like there are hard things about having limited bodies and hard things about having broken bodies. And if I believe that the gospel is good news and meets us in all parts of our lives, then I have to believe it meets us in those parts too. So that was how I got interested in it. And I kept trying to come up with something else to talk about. And I just kept going back to these stories of Jesus and sick and broken people. And so that's how I got more interested in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like that word limitation is really interesting. And you're right, because Dave talks about it in Low Anthropology, which was very eye-opening for me, and just the idea that I think we're not only blind to our limitations, but we like push them aside. Like we refuse to let that be a thing that indicates we need help or anything else. And I was listening to your Mockingbird talk, and I feel like you do a good job of kind of showing that limitation isn't just like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, like I think it can be an effect of sin. It could be something just caused by sin, but there's also just something to being human that means we're limited, right? Like it's not necessarily related to sin always. Is that kind of how you've seen it, or how would you define that term limitation when it comes to our bodies in a helpful way for people?
Yeah, I think that I think of Jesus healing the blind man, which was our reading in the lectionary in my church this past week, and everyone wants to know why he's hurt or why he's blind. And and they say, did his parents sin? Did he sin? And Jesus says, no, like that's not what this is. This is so the glory of God may be displayed in him. And that glory is a redemptive glory, right? That makes things new and good. And he heals the man. And I have always appreciated that, because people, I've shared this before, I feel like I just haven't gotten over it. But one of the things when I told someone in the middle of my huge depression that I was thinking about hurting myself, the first question they asked me was, do you have any unconfessed sin in your life? Which I thought, yes, of course, we all do. Who doesn't have any unconfessed sin? Which is, I understand, he was a young youth pastor. I don't blame him at all. But I think there's a real tie between anything that is not perfect and sin. And I think some of that is true. Like, I think the limitations we face are part of the fact that our world is broken and not as it should be. Even things that are not caused by sin, right? Like the man born blind, that is part of our broken world. That being said, there are things that are an effect of sin. But I think we tend to want to blame everything on that. And I think they're just parts that being a human means you need to sleep, right? You need to eat. You need to rest. You need to, I don't know, move your body. They're just things that it's part of being human. And so I think sometimes we want to blame it on something. And that's just not always the case. And it's also very human to want to make a compelling story out of things, like we were just talking about. Like there's a lesson in it for you, or a sin you need to stop doing. And I think sometimes it's completely out of our control. And that was something that, especially from a mental health standpoint, is really important for me, because I think the church has not necessarily done a great job with telling people that this is part of being human, as opposed to like something you yourself have brought on yourself.
I feel like it's almost like if you can couch all limitation in sin, then in a wrong theology approach is then, oh well, if it's sin, I can overcome it. Actually,
Right.
Which is strange, because, like you're saying, some of our limitations are just because we're human and we're created and we're not God, and like that's why we need Him. But it's not necessarily, they're not always things that we can overcome, and that's okay. Like that's a good thing. You said that you had people early on when you were younger tell you really good things about the body and then really bad things. What have you found on both sides, whether it's some like a personal experience you've had with the church and how they've approached the body? Like, what are some of the best things that you've found theologically to help, and then some of the things that you've been like, oh, we're getting this wrong and this is not what the Bible's talking about?
I get nerdy about words, but we talk a lot about how we have a body. And I said this in my talk, so you can ignore it. But our language around bodies is really interesting. And, I walked through the Barnes & Noble section, and it's like all about tech right now, and that we're machines, and we're not.
Yes.
We're creatures. We were created. That's my favorite part to think about, is like in Psalm 139, he saw us before we knew who we were. And he sees us at the end, and he knows everything about us, and we're not a machine, and our bodies don't work that way. I find it really frustrating that calories in and calories out isn't a thing, because our body is programmed to prevent us from starving. Right. And so, it's not just as simple as, if I eat the right food and take my vitamins, I'll never get sick. Like, it's much more complicated than that. And so I think we have forgotten in some ways, including in the church, that we are not machines, and I think that comes across in a lot of areas of our lives. We've talked about our kids. Like, if I just read all the right books to my kids and, send them to the right school, then this will be their outcome. And it's just so much more complicated than that.
Right.
And I think when the church can acknowledge that and say, like, there are struggles and there are great things, and you're not in control. God is in control. And ultimately, his story is the one that will be told. I think that's really beneficial. I think the other thing that the church, our church here, does really well, and I think in general I've seen the church approach it better, is with mental health and providing counseling and resources and things where it's not as blame oriented and shame oriented, but is very open and out there that people are getting help and need help in those areas. I think that's very helpful and very different than how it was even 20 years ago when I was first diagnosed. And
for sure.
I think also the idea of pain is one that was really helpful for me, that when things are painful, I think it's Philip Brand and or Philip Yancey. I'll have to look up who it is, but they talked about leprosy and how people who have leprosy would love to feel pain, because that's how they get hurt and die, is because they don't feel any pain. And so for me, that really helped me frame my physical pain as not a gift and like everything's great now, but it tells me something's not right. It tells me that there are things I need to do to be healthier and different. And it kind of reframed it for me to see it as not only for myself, like, oh, I should stop and rest because I feel pain, but also for the world. Like, I'm feeling sadness and pain and despair about something. It's because the world is broken. And, I can see those ways that God is working, or, in the midst of those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. That pain serves a purpose. Like it points us
Yeah.
to the fact that things aren't the way that they should be.
Right.
Like you said, there's been some really good changes recently in how the church wrestles with mental illness and mental health as a whole, collectively, which is really, really helpful. And I even think this topic of the body and theology of the body it seems like to me it's becoming more talked about and more important. Have you noticed that at all? Like, do you feel like as a whole, just talking about physicality is something that's on the rise, and
Um,
is something that's relevant or not?
yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm trying to think if it's on the rise or if it's just that I have gotten more interested in it. But I think it's both.
Yeah, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
especially as I mean, I'm still young. I'm not aging. But as I've had children and
Yeah.
as I've hit 40, all these things, as I make friends who are a lot older, I think people are just talking about it a little bit more. And also recognizing that
Mhm.
the patterns we've had and the ways that we've approached bodies, which is either thinking about them as like kind of superfluous or as bad. I think
Yes.
both of those
Yeah.
are seen as not helpful. Um,
Mhm.
and, we go through our lives with our bodies. When our bodies stop working, we are actually not alive anymore. And so
Yeah.
everything about us is embodied. We can't experience anything that doesn't also involve our body. And I think people are more aware of that. I think that the idea that our mind is over our body and that somehow our body is just sort of carrying our soul around or our mind, I think people are recognizing that's not the case. The science is really interesting around
Mhm.
things like self-control right now. So many of our decisions are not actually our
Mm.
conscious decisions. That
Hmm.
Yeah, some of it is just so interesting. So I think especially in the church, we've had this idea like people who are not healthy are somehow lacking in self-control or lacking in some sort of discipline.
Yeah,
That's something
okay.
I've heard a lot. And
Mhm.
I think the science and the church are catching up to the fact that there are a variety of reasons that people might not be healthy. And it isn't just as simple as like them having more self-control or discipline. And I think the more grace we can extend to
Yeah.
people around those things, the better it is. And I think people have started to recognize that as they see plenty of people
Yep.
around them who are suffering
Yeah.
in different ways.
That's interesting. And like you mentioned earlier, you said that you'd noticed so much of the language nowadays about bodies is centers around like technology or is technological. But I wonder too if, in a good way, some of this response to the need to talk about bodies and to realize we're embodied, and that's like, as Christians we believe that is intentional and serves a purpose, is to this pushback against kind of just this digital, everything is in the cloud, um, everything's intangible age. I don't know, if that has anything to do with it at all, but that's kind of where my mind goes when I think about it.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of that pushback. Like we don't all want to be avatars, right? Like when
Right.
I don't remember. I think when Facebook became Meta or whatever, and they were talking about the metaverse and how we were all going to live there, there was a pushback against that because everyone was like, that's not the real
Yeah.
world. That's an experience, but that doesn't
Mhm.
involve um, your body. It doesn't involve your senses. And as someone who was very afraid of bodily sensations, like a fear or anxiety, like I would have a panic attack, and so Um, I hate that feeling of like my heart racing and getting nervous or things. And so I try to not feel that, but that actually doesn't help me. And so a lot of my work with counselors and people around me is to re-embody and to feel those things, because those are how we were created to respond to things. Now, my body needs to learn that I don't need to panic about whether or not I turn the coffee maker off in the same way that I would if I like my life was threatened. Like my body right now sort of has that same heart racing fear, and you have to learn difference. But I look at my kids and they just live their life fully embodied. You know, they will tell me I feel this way. And my littlest especially will say, my tummy feels funny because I am shy and I had to meet a bunch of new people. And I'm like, oh, I would not have connected those dots, you know, but for her, she's like, well, obviously I know how to, you know, I know what's going on. So I think we lose that as we get older and think we should be more in control of those sensations and feelings. Sometimes I think the church, because the flesh is portrayed as bad, because there are, you know, verses about the flesh and being, you know, the flesh is the desires of the flesh. Like there is parts of our bodies that are, you know, not helpful sometimes. Like, I don't know how to describe that. This is not making sense. But I think sometimes we've taken that to mean all of the information in our bodies is bad, and all of the things that our bodies do is bad, and that we should somehow rise above it because we're these believers and God has taken us out of that. And I just don't see that necessarily in my own life. I don't know how people rise above that or not.
I think that's where, for me, what's been really helpful is the idea of being sinner saint, and the fact that, like, I could be wrong, but I think a lot of times when the Bible is talking about the flesh, what they're really talking about is like the old man, the old woman, in the flesh. And then the spirit is not like spirit as in you're only a spiritual being without a body, but like the new creation that we've been named and we've already been created in Christ. And I think that then can get confusing if you don't realize like those two things in this life are happening simultaneously 100%. But that to me was that idea was very clarifying of like, okay, it's not like flesh bad, spirit good. It's the fact that my sinful nature is bad, even though I'm dealing with it my whole entire life. And yet I've been called, I've been recreated in Christ, and someday all of that pain and suffering is not going to be a part of my story. I don't know. That's been a thing that's been helpful. And I think if you don't have that distinction, that can be a difficult thing to kind of wrestle with a little bit. So.
Yeah, I think I tend to be a black and white thinker. I think a lot of people do. And I think sometimes some of those verses come across very much as like, it's either your body or not your body. And that isn't how I think it's meant to be taken. But I think I, as a younger person, exactly. And I think I took it to be everything about my body is bad. And, you know, I should only think about things that are spiritual, whatever that means to my 16-year-old self. But learning that God gave us bodies and that it is part of his plan. I think Jesus became fully man and had a body. You know, I think that's an important part of our faith. And I was really struck by that this Christmas in a children's sermon of all things, when they were talking about how Jesus became not only man, but a baby, which like going back to limitations, like you and I have both had babies, they're super limited. They can do nothing for themselves. And that just sort of gave me, there's something about our bodies that is key to our humanity, and it's not all wrong.
Right. Yeah, that is so true and so profound when you really think about it, that he entered into our limitation on purpose, and that he had to do that in order to save us from those limitations that are killing us. Like, I think that
Right.
that's a really beautiful thing. I think something that hit me really hard was how, which again, it's right there in scripture, but how integral physical healing was to his ministry. Like, um it's not like it happens once or twice. Like you said, I think you said earlier, it happens all the time. And I think you said this in your talk. You said that he's healing those people who have like nothing to give, nothing to bring. Like, it's clearly the people that are, um, or it's in instances when people are bringing like nothing to the table, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think he goes out of his way to heal people that are not like the all-star cast. I think it is people who,
Yeah.
I mean, also to be fair, anyone with physical limitations in his time were considered cursed because they did believe that all of those things were caused by sin or by someone not following the law
Yeah.
or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how much Jesus touches people. That's the other thing that I sort of always thought that I guess I just wasn't paying that much attention, but I kind of sort of thought he just did it verbally or, kind of spoke healing over them, but he actually physically touches almost
Yeah.
everyone he heals. Outside of demon possessed people, it
Yes.
doesn't
Yeah.
say that he touches them. Um but I found that so interesting that even the woman who's healed when she touches his robes in, I just looked it up, Luke 8, she touches him and he, that power is from his physical body that heals her. And so it's fascinating to
Mm-hmm.
me how we are healed, or they are healed through his body, through his touch. And then we are healed through his
Mm-hmm.
body
Mm-hmm.
in his death and resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
I think I was writing about it at one point and thought, I wonder what that felt like. Did it feel like you were getting like shocked, or was it just a really nice pat on the shoulder?
Yeah.
Like, you kind of wonder what that would be like. Like, how did that
Yeah.
happen? But the fact that Jesus lived on earth and had hands to touch people and heal them with is a really beautiful thing. And the fact that some of them were crying out to them. And then, like I was talking about the man born blind, he was just walking along. Our priest pointed that out this Sunday. He
Mm-hmm.
said he wasn't even looking for Jesus. He wasn't even looking to be healed. And he's
Yeah.
just walking along, and Jesus stopped him and made the mud and put it on his eyes. It's such a beautiful picture of how we are healed and restored at times that we don't even know we need it or wouldn't even think to hope for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
really cool.
Or not doing anything actively in order to get it. Because I think that's where sometimes this can go sideways, is when people are like, if you're not praying and you're not like doing X, Y, and Z, then, which is just another example of like us trying to control and like overtake God's omniscience and his power and his ability to heal. But um, I think that that's something that this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's related. Like, I really, every time I look at this, I do find a little bit of tension in the fact that healing was so central to Jesus' ministry on earth. And yet we're not promised healing, right? Like, we're not
Yeah.
promised that whatever ails us is going to go away. We're not promised freedom from that in this life. Have you wrestled with that at all? And if you have, like, where have you kind of landed um, on that? Because that's something that I think I do still struggle with, like how to word and talk about, because I don't want to give people this false idea that faith in Christ equals physical healing or whatever.
Yeah. It's Good question. So when I was, after my major depression, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a chronic mental illness that has brain disorder that has no cure. Like there's just you don't grow out of it. You don't, sometimes things like depression can be sort of for a season, and then you can, come out of that. And every time I meet a psychiatrist, they're like, no, we need to talk about the fact that there isn't a cure. I'm like, yes, I'm aware. Thank you. And so every time it's like, let's just crush that hope for a minute. And like, you're going to deal with this for the rest of your life. Yes, I'm aware. Thank you. For me, I remember telling my husband the thing that saved my life was telling someone that I was struggling, telling someone I wanted to hurt myself. And I told my husband, I was like, what if that was the miracle, was humbling myself and saying, I need professional help. I need someone to take care of me. What if that was the miracle that I didn't even know was a miracle? And he said, based on your stubbornness, it was a miracle that you would ask for help. He was like, that is a huge thing that you would have stopped and said, I can't do this by myself. I'm not capable of taking care of myself. And so sometimes I think we look for healing in these big miraculous ways, like in the Bible, and it might just be a changing of our will. It might be in little ways. And for some people, and I manage my obsessive compulsive disorder. I still have it pop up every once in a while. I still have, obsessions and compulsions, hence the name. And I manage it really well, but it will never go away. And so I think healing can look really different. I think we sometimes have this idea that if we're not completely and fully made perfect right now, that somehow God hasn't worked in that situation. And there are just so many stories of people where God is wildly at work, but they're not made whole and well. And I think we're actually promised that in the Bible, right? Like we're not promised that our lives are going to be perfect and free of suffering. We're promised like you will have troubles. And so for me, I think noticing the times that I don't operate like that, clearly God was at work. If I was listening to myself, I would have tried to push through, but instead I went and got help. Noticing those small miracles and the way that God intervened in that way and ultimately saved my life, like that's pretty cool too. But it is really hard because you do see him heal a lot of people in the Bible. And I do think to myself, like, how come somebody gets healed and I don't? Like, that'd be really great. Or, friends who've passed away. I'm like, well, how did you not heal their cancer, but you healed this person's, or, and that's just a tension I think we always have. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I was reading Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking, which was a real slog this year. But I read it and I was struck by how sometimes I think Christians are really good at magical thinking and it's not actually based in our faith. So we have this idea that like we're in control of so much more than we are. That if we just do something, if we pray, if we have faith, that God will respond to that. And that's not what God's responding to. He's responding to his love for his children. He's responding to the fact that we're his created beings, and I think, not to make this a whole Mockingbird crossover episode, but Aaron Zimmerman was talking about Lazarus and the healing of Lazarus. And he said, these are not people who like had some faith and then God responded. He was like, these are people who are like, no, this guy's dead. Like you missed your chance. There's no hope. And God still shows up. And I think sometimes I like to look back at the stories where it's people who have no faith or nothing to offer, because it reminds me that I don't have to do anything else to be loved and forgiven. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
no, I think it does. I think what I hear you saying is kind of getting at this idea that God doesn't work. He doesn't work in the categories we can think up or we can like put him in always. Like those categories can be helpful sometimes for us to understand what's going on, but he doesn't work in categories. He doesn't work in equations that are always the same. And yet, at the same time, there is something to be said about him being very consistent in the promises he has given in Scripture, like the promise that we will be with him someday, that he has saved us through Christ's death and resurrection. Like, so that it is this interesting tension of like, he's going to show up, he's going to do it when and how and where he wants. And yet, even when that's like maybe overwhelming and we can't deal with that, we have like this solid promise to return to again and again. That's helpful for me because I am very much a category and equation person. Like I would love for it to be really clean and neat and easy to understand, and it's just not always that way. So I think that was helpful, the way that you kind of laid it out. And I think it's such an issue, especially when we think of, again, these like semi categories of physical and spiritual and earthly and heavenly. Like they can become very black and white very quickly and that isn't always helpful.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we have this category of like the broken world and what we know the future will hold, like what the redeemed new heaven and new earth will look like. And we live in that tension of the already and not yet. And I think that's true in our bodies too. So we know that our bodies will be healed. There'll be no more pain and no more suffering and no more tears, but we're not there yet. And so I think some of the tension is that we know what it will be like, and we want that now. And we're in this time of waiting for it. And that we're not, humans are notoriously bad at waiting. At least I am. And and that's just where we are, So we've been redeemed. We've been promised that this is our future. We can cling to that promise, but it's not yet. And that's really hard.
Yeah, it is very hard. It's not an easy thing by any means. We've kind of been talking about this, I feel like, the whole time, but is there anything in when you kind of started looking at this and as far as how Scripture talks about the physical and the body, anything that we haven't talked about that stood out to you or surprised you that you weren't really expecting?
I just come back to, like, we have these broken bodies and limited bodies, and we experience pain and limitation, to use our favorite word. And I'm just blown away that God's redemptive plan involved him having a body, and not just a body, but a broken body. And we, every week, the centerpiece of our service is this body broken and this bloodshed. And when I consider that, the fact that God understands that and knows that pain and frustration brings me a lot of comfort in that I'm not alone in that. And that's the other thing is I speak more about my limitations and brokenness, the more people come to me and say, oh, I have, whether it's OCD or this jaw thing or whatever, people keep coming up and saying, so I'm not alone in terms of everybody has something, right? But more importantly, I have a God who isn't above me in this way, isn't saying like, oh, buck up, it's not that bad, but who understands that and can have compassion for that. And that, again, the whole redemptive plan is centered on a body broken. Just implies to me that there's something about bodies and brokenness that God works through and that is inherently of value.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's beautiful. I know you've done a ton of reading on this, so I was curious if you would share some of your favorite resources with people, because I know that you have quite the reading list on theology of the body.
My favorites, I actually have them right here because I wanted to make sure I got them all. Okay. I love Kate Bowler's Everything Happens for a Reason. She is amazing. Okay. And
I've heard that's great.
I actually found this one at Laity Lodge. It's called Broken Body, Healing Spirit. It's about Lectio Divina and contemplative Bible reading for those who live with illness.
Okay.
It's a really interesting book with a lot of practices for embodiment, but also very centered in the Bible and the Word. Rowan Williams wrote a book called Being Human that's very philosophical but beautiful. Talks a lot about how that connection of body and spirit is real and is not to be ignored. And then they're not religious books, but The Invisible Kingdom by Meghan O'Rourke is about chronic illness, and specifically in America. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at. The American promise of if you work really hard, everything works out for you, falls apart when you have chronic illness. And our medical system is set up that way. So it's just a really interesting book. So those were some of my very favorites, but I'm sure there are more out there. And then, of course, our friends, awesome. I mean, he's not our friend. I've never met him, but Kleinig's book.
I count him as a friend. Yeah, I count him as a friend.
Okay, he's your friend.
It's Wonderfully Made, yet, right? By John Kleinig.
Wonderfully Made is another great one that I think he does such a good job of talking about the dignity of people in that book and the design of our bodies being a gift as opposed to just something to overcome.
Yes. Yeah, that book is so theological, and we've both talked about this. It's a little bit dense, but if you want what Scripture has to say about bodies in a way that's good and redemptive, that's definitely something that you should read because it's amazing. So, well, Jane, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I'm excited for people to hear this. So thanks for sharing with us.
Anytime. I'm kind of a nerd about this, so thanks for having me.
Yeah, so glad we're internet friends and real friends. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. I would love to hear from you, and I would love to hear what you're learning through these conversations. I know I learn something new every week, and I really hope that that is the case for you as well. So if you want to shoot me a DM on social media or give me an email at kelsey@1517.org. I would love to hear from you. Have a great couple weeks. We'll see you back here next time.